Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are in for a treat today. We have Zeina Azzam with us, sharing some of her work and just being in conversation about writing in general. And Zeina, where are you zooming in from today?
Hi, everyone, and hi, Danusha and James. I am in Alexandria, Virginia.
That's right. And you're poet laureate of Alexandria, Virginia. Is that right?
That is correct. I became poet laureate in April of this year, and it's a 3-year term. So
Wow.
I'm, I'm in several months into it now, and it's just been very, very exciting.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Do you have a particular focus or project, or is it more just that sense of seeding poetry in the community?
Well, it's definitely that, but it's also there are lots of things actually. There are commemorations that the city has, and they asked me to write a poem for them, which is, really interesting. It's challenging in some ways, but I find it so wonderful that our city wants to uplift poetry like this and to have it be part of events. So I've done 6 poems like that
Oh my
already.
gosh.
Wow.
And some were a lot harder than others to write. And I have a workshop coming up. I have some readings, so it's actually quite a bit, quite a few responsibilities.
Mhm. Yeah, I was going to say a busy 3 years, probably.
Yes, but honestly, I'm just so honored and so
Yeah.
really excited to play this role.
Wow. And we'd love if you'd say a bit for our listeners too about your background and how you came to poetry.
You mean in terms of family background or?
Too. Any of it. I'll
Oh,
inquiry
oh.
minds want to know.
Um, well, I guess I'll start with family. So my family is Palestinian. My parents were refugees. They became refugees in 1948, and they fled from what was then Palestine, and they fled to Syria, lived there for many years, and I was actually born in Syria. And we then moved to Lebanon, to Beirut, where I had my childhood. I was only 2 years old when we moved to Beirut. And then when I was 10, we moved to the US. So I've had most of my life now in the United States, but those years were very figural. They were very important in my experience and my identity. I do write about those years. I write, and of course, I've visited many times too. So I have my connection is alive, and so I write a lot about being in between spaces, between cultures, between different languages, and so that's where my family background is. My poetry, I've always loved poetry. I remember distinctly when I was a teenager, and I would ride my bike to the library. This is in upstate New York. That's where we moved to. And I would go in the library and I would sit on the cool floor. It would be summer, and I would sit in the poetry aisle actually. I would just like pick a book and start reading it and put it back and then pick another. I just would sit there for a long time and do that. I remember doing that quite a bit. I have my journals from that time.
Oh, wow.
But I didn't study it in college. I kind of I studied music and psychology. That was kind of what I did. And so even though I kept writing throughout my life, I think it's only in the last 10, 12 years that I really focused on it as something I wanted to do more seriously. I started, sending my poems out for publication. And so I feel like I'm a late bloomer in a way.
Well, there's so many threads to pull here, and that weave your story together. And I think this part of holding ourselves as late bloomers is such a good thing to talk about, in addition to all the other parts and of your story. Because often people think, oh, I started too late. It's too late to do this. And I told myself that story too for a while. Uh,
Mhm.
but in some ways, late blooming is the best blooming in some ways, I think.
I'm happy to hear you say that.
I think
Well, why do you think it's the best?
we know more about ourselves. We have more experience, and I maybe a little bit of a thicker skin sometimes, like the me that would think, oh, one person didn't like my work, I got a rejection, why try? That sort of has faded for me. And I think age is part of that. And I think that all strong writing comes from a willingness to say what needs to be said. And probably my willingness also increases with age. How did you find that, Zeina? Has that been true for you maybe too? Or
Yeah, that what you said really resonates for me. Although I'm not sure how much of a thicker skin I've grown. I'm still very sensitive. I mean, across the board.
yeah.
But I agree with you. I do, when I get a rejection or whatever, I push forward and try again. And you're right. I think I'm far less worried about what people think of me. Although I say that, and I also then think of times when I do feel worried about it. But I think as you grow older, as you mature, that does happen. And I have older children, and they're out of the house and they're married, and it's just I think that frees me up to have all the time to myself.
That's true.
Which
Yeah.
makes a huge difference. And the pandemic really, made that happen more. And I realized that I really, as much as I miss my children and my friends during the pandemic, I realized that I actually was happy as a clam being at home
Yeah.
and writing and reading, it was so
Yeah.
interesting.
Yes. Yes. It's the introvert's dream
Yeah.
in many ways. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. It strikes me that we should have you read a poem. We've so enjoyed getting to know you that I forgot to invite you in the first moments to please read one of your poems.
Thanks.
Or more than one if you want in a row, but we'll.
Yeah. I mean, I could read something from my book from, about my childhood. I could read about one of the poems that I wrote for Alexandria. Happy to do that, or happy to do both.
Begin wherever you like.
Okay. Let's see. This is a poem called Leaving My Childhood Home. I'll read that, and then I'll read another one called Immigrant. So, leaving my childhood home. On our last day in Beirut, with my 10 years packed in a suitcase, my best friend asked for a keepsake. I found a little tin box to give her, emptied of lemon drops that would hold memories of our childhood. Us swinging in the dusty schoolyard, rooftop hide and seek, wispy sweet jasmine, kilos of summertime figs, king of falafels, tahini bathed sandwiches, our pastel autograph books. All those remembrances crammed in that box, tiny storytellers waiting to speak. Later, her family would uproot too, transplant like surly Palestinian weeds pulled every few years. We all knew about this, even the kids. I never saw her again, but know that she also learned to travel lightly, hauling empty boxes, pulsing with kilos of memories.
Oh my gosh.
Wow, so
That made
moving.
me- well,
Yeah, yeah. I felt it too.
that's
Thank you.
Mm.
Thank you.
that's
Okay. Go ahead, James. Sorry.
No, yeah, I was really moved by that too and found myself tearing up. And, that what really struck me, was all of it, of course, but especially that image of the tin box emptied of lemon drops. And then you come back to the image of empty boxes again at the end. And that idea of traveling lightly and being in between, which I think when you spoke about it earlier, it's like we sort of understand intellectually that it's such a rich place to write from. And it's also such a hard place to live in, that in-betweenness and the moving and what can feel really chaotic.
Well, thanks for saying that. As I grew up, I often thought about this being of two cultures and being in that space in between was kind of a liability. I sort of didn't belong, in either place. But then as I've grown older, I really I like to think of it, and I feel it. I feel it that it's actually a real asset. It's a really enriching place to be, because not only have I experienced all these different things, but it's also just made me aware in a larger sense about the world. And being Palestinian and having my parents be refugees and all the injustices that are perpetrated against Palestinians make me much more aware and empathetic toward other people who are marginalized. So there's a lot of positive in these experiences, and that's kind of how I look at it all.
yeah.
And maybe that comes, Danusha, as you were saying, from being older and having had the years.
Yeah. Those years. Yeah.
Yes.
Tend to do that.
Yes.
It's so layered what you're saying, because of course the pain of displacement combined with the awareness, the expanding awareness of just what is the experience of being human around the world, and how it contains these kind of stories for so many. It's a rich mind there.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can't help but wonder if we overlapped living in Beirut.
Oh, did you live there?
I went to preschool there. I lived there for a year. And so when you were describing playing with the girls, I was flashing back to my own memories of the girls in my cul-de-sac.
Oh my goodness. That's amazing.
Isn't that wild? When you first were telling your story, I was like, oh, I wonder. And I remember how we loved that when the businessmen were walking home, they would give us money to buy candy at the little corner store. So you would kind of wait.
Oh, that's amazing. So you have a lot of memories from that time.
For some reason, yeah, I have a lot of memories, even though I was quite small, but I do not remember some of the more traumatic things. I don't remember times when there were bombings and we had to stay inside. My memory has locked some of that, but I imagine you do. You were there till you were 10.
Yeah, but I didn't experience that. I mean, I remember, going to refugee camps. I remember seeing a lot, but I was there much earlier than you were, I think.
Okay.
Much older than you are. But,
I'm so bad at age.
um, but I've been there I went to Beirut right after the Civil War, a couple years after, so I saw a lot.
Yeah.
So maybe I was there then when you were there.
Maybe.
But it's, yeah.
Mm. I just want to mention your book too, Zeina. Bena Bena, in case people want to get a hold of it. It's a wonderful chapbook. And it is in between, right? That's the translation of that. And yeah, just such a perfect title for the poems that you write. And it's not even just about being in that place of in-betweenness. I think your poems also help create bridges for us to those experiences that you have had over the years, and very different experiences than many of us might have had. And I'm just thinking of the vividness of those summertime figs that you described in that poem. I mean, is there anything, I think we said this in a previous interview too, is there anything more luscious than a ripe fig? It's so
Right.
amazing. And just how food really can be one of those bridges that kind of crosses that in-between place. And I'm thinking of your poem Nine Spice Mix that was on the Academy of American Poets, I think this past year. So
Well, thanks for mentioning that. I actually love to write about food, and I have a kind of a funny poem. Maybe I should. I don't know if I have it available. I'll see if I can find it. But
yeah.
I went to a workshop many years ago, and it was an Arab American workshop about writing and identity, and there was a whole speech, or two different people actually were talking about writing about food, and they were saying, don't write about food because it really just reduces the culture to, tabbouleh and hummus, right? And I felt like, oh, that's not how I think of it. To me, food is just so much more than that. And so I went home and wrote this poem. And let me see if I can find it, but
Yeah.
it's
Well, I think some of the best poems are written in defiance
Yeah.
of what people tell you not to write about. Because I love breaking the rules. I've never liked authority. So I'm always like, you can't write about the moon? No, that's not okay.
That's not
I'm not okay with that.
yeah, it's so funny.
And
That's
not
so
sign
funny.
off on never writing about the moon again.
Agreed.
I didn't pull that one out, so I have to look for it. I'm sorry, but I could read
No.
something else if you prefer. I could read Nine Spice Mix that you had mentioned, James.
Yeah, let's read that one. I mean, you're welcome to take a few more minutes if you want to. But
Yeah, we can talk amongst ourselves.
yeah.
Okay.
That's what we do, right, James?
That's right. Yeah, I'm kind of attached to hearing this one poem now. But if we don't hear it, we can always send it out later or something like that. Because I'm sure our community will be like, "Did you ever find that poem?"
They will. That's right. So we might as well have it now. And also, it makes me realize how important it is to bring all the aspects of the cultures that we come from into our work, whether it's Palestinian background or Caribbean, or it's living in the South and growing up in the Southern US, and the foods that you ate and the music that played in your home. That kind of subject matter is so rich in our writing.
Absolutely. And I found it. So I just want to say one thing before I read it, and that is in Arabic, the word for baklava is baklawa. Baklawa. It's with a W, not a V. And so, and I use that. I use that in the poem. And the poem is called At the Workshop on Ethnicity and Identity. We are advised not to write anymore about tabbouleh and hummus, baba ganoush, lemony grape leaves stuffed with rice and meat. Our culture is larger than the life of the chickpea from sprout to table, or the time it takes to eat a bowl of minted yogurt, rolled cabbage with garlic cloves, stuffed baby squash. Mujaddara with caramelized onions is beyond the pale now. Let's not talk about eggplants and pine nuts or ground pistachios ornamenting baklawa in sweet syrup, orange blossom water in lemonade, cardamom infused coffee. And should we mention the special food served when a baby is born, a tooth appears, someone dies, the moon a thin crescent before Ramadan, Easter's arrival. A baklawa backlash is unfolding, and I am starved for metaphors.
Oh, wow. I love that humor and subversion in the same poem.
I know. And that amazing food.
Right.
It's incredible, the description of the food from the, and what struck me is the tenderness when we're looking at the time it takes for the chickpea to sprout. I think that was in there. And then the squash blossoms and the baby squash, just, it's so tender and delicate and opulent at the same time. And then when we have that braced against what, the historical situation of the Palestinian people, there's just a real tension between those in the poem, even without speaking that. Like, here is a culture that makes all of these beautiful things.
And really, we do have an Arab culture. We do make a special food when a baby is born. And we do have, when the baby's first tooth comes, we make a special pudding for that and invite friends and family, And of course, there are all these Easter cookies, and also, it's just, we have all these things. And so the idea of not writing about food when I'm writing about my culture and my experiences growing up and now, it just doesn't make sense,
It's kind of impossible as an assignment, because what is culture? It's so many things, but they are rooted. It seems to me the mother of culture is language and food.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the mother. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so glad we took the time to find that poem. It was so worth it. And I love that you mentioned the moon in the poem too. That wasn't even planned.
I have to say, I have the moon a lot in my poems, and I don't know what people don't want to use the moon, but I did a whole master's thesis on the moon in Mahmoud Darwish's poetry. That was my whole master's thesis.
Oh my gosh, wow.
Me, I don't know, the moon is just very, very important. I find that I write a lot about the moon, or somehow I use a moon image. I write a lot about the river. I live near the Potomac River, and I walk by it every day, so it's kind of my place, my space. And then I write a lot about trees. I think those are the three things. And I know I'm not unique, but these things all really inspire me and speak to me, and I find so many pieces of wisdom contemplating them or looking at, it's just, there's so much richness there.
Yeah.
I love how in these conversations with writers and poets, there are always themes that emerge. And I'm really hearing a theme around permission. I think that's how I want to phrase it. There's sister themes there too, but I think writing the things that people tell us not to write, and allowing ourselves focus, like just you saying that you wrote a thesis to do with the moon in a particular writer's work. How many people out there are like, I didn't know you could write a thesis about I did not know you could do that. I want to go back in time and do that. So beautiful. And I think that it's the permission to love what we love and to
Mm.
talk about it. And often I hear writers expressing, oh, so and so has already written that, or everyone's done that and they did it maybe better than I could.
Mm.
But that's what stops us in our tracks.
Mhm.
And so I think you're a good role model of someone who's saying, no, this is what I love.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, and it's like you said before, Zena, that, for so long you thought that idea of living in between cultures was a liability. But when you gave yourself permission, perhaps, to look deeper, you realize, like, oh, this is actually where the richness is. This is where my uniqueness is. So that when you're writing about the moon, having studied the moon in Mahmoud Darwish's work, you're writing about the moon in an entirely different way than someone else, might be writing about the moon. And I think that's part of the lesson too, is that we might think certain things are off the table because other people have done it too much or we've been told not to do it. But you prove that you can do it in your very own way, and in fact that is the way that's needed, because we've never had someone who has written about food or Palestinian culture or fill in the blank in the same way that you have. And
Mm.
so there's even that larger sense of permission there too, like we need each person to write about these things in a way that's particular to their experience.
Well, thank you for saying that. I like this whole idea of permission. And I like to, it's really interesting to think that way. I did want to say though about the moon, I'm organizing a reading with a moon theme.
I love
What?
that.
So funny, when I apply, because you have to apply for the poet laureate position and you have to have a 90-day plan.
Wow.
And one of the things that I had in my plan and the panel loved, and of course I love it, and so I'm delighted to be doing it, was to organize a reading in Alexandria with the moon theme on the night of the full moon.
Wow.
And to have people come and read from different cultures, because every culture has poetry about the moon.
Mm.
And so like I remember reading Federico Garcia Lorca. He's written a lot about the moon, and and a friend of mine who speaks French tells me about some of the moon poetry she has. So I'm hoping to have people come from different cultures and read them actually in their languages and then the translations. And of course, anybody else who wants to read just in English too. Anyway, I'm working on it. I'm hoping it'll be in February.
Mm.
And the full moon that month is, I think, February 5th. So I think we're doing it on the 4th because we couldn't do it on the 5th. It's going to be at one of the public libraries. So that's kind of a different, take on how to look at the moon and look at poetry of the moon while we're drawing on the diversity in our community.
Mm.
That sounds so delicious, Zeina. I really
Yeah.
wish that I could be there. That's just such a gorgeous idea. And even though we say, oh yes, people write about the moon, I have yet to hear of a reading like this.
Mm.
And it makes me think of a conversation with, I think, one of the people who connects us, Naomi Shihavnai, where she once said, there could be an entire anthology about rice if everyone wrote about the rice in their culture, in their household, an anthology of rice.
Yeah.
And that's also so true. And there's something about taking a common thread, but that people see differently and from a different vantage point, different tradition. It's a really beautiful idea, especially in a culture like this one, where we're such a combination.
Yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can see where people might say food is reductive, but at the same time, like, think about all the different kinds of rice based on country and culture. And I feel like someone was just telling me about the about these hummus wars, like each culture thinks that they have the best hummus. And so there are differences between cultures, even though it's, quote unquote, the same food, it's not the same at all.
It's not the same.
Well, and there's a lot of political stuff going on, especially about hummus, actually, that you mentioned it. Because, the Palestinians say this is our dish, and the Israelis are, you're expropriating it just like you've expropriated our land. I mean, it's a political thing. It's holding on to your own culture and the manifestations of the culture. And that's really important. All these things become crucial in holding them close.
I had no idea, but that makes absolute sense that, food is as culturally and politically loaded as language, right? That Danusha was saying, we have food and language that are these two main sources of culture.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow.
I wonder if you want to read another poem. You could read the immigrant one that you mentioned that you wrote for Alexandra.
I could. I also just want to say that I don't only write about these cultural experiences.
Right.
I write about a lot of other things.
Yeah.
And so, I'm happy to read something else. I've been having to write these poems for, as I mentioned, commemorations in the city. And these have been really intense. We have in Alexandria a documented history of 2 lynchings. And the community has gotten together to learn about this, raise awareness about this history. And people have gone to Montgomery, Alabama, to the Equal Justice Initiative and the museum there, and taken soil from here to there. And it's just a huge community project, and it's amazing, and it's beautiful in so many ways, and it's extremely, profound. And I've had to write 3 different poems for dealing with these lynching commemorations. And those have been really challenging in a way, because it's just so, fraught. There's just so much emotion there. And at the same time, for me as a poet, it's been hard to not get into that activist voice, that angry voice, that sort of almost like a journalist, like writing poetry that's lyrical, and it's just sometimes really hard to do with these kinds of topics. So that's been really something. If you'd like, I could read one of those.
Yeah, since we're talking about it, but anything you like, always.
So we had the ceremony, the soil collection ceremony, where they collected soil from each of the places where these 2 young men lived who were lynched. So it's not just where they were lynched, but also where they went to school, where they went to church, which was really a really nice way to do that. And so they had the actual soil, and people came and picked up the soil and felt it. And so I could read that if you would like.
Sure.
The earth speaks. The earth speaks. Listen to the stories from beneath our feet. Gather the soil, touch it, smell it. Reply with your breath and heart. This hallowed ground witnessed despicable deeds. It cries in pain. Let us open our ears to hear the mobs, fists, whips, guns, and chains. Let us comprehend the horror of those on the lamppost, of the noose on the lamppost. We must look back to sense the wounds and grief, the wrongs inflicted on the agonized and the aggrieved. At the same time, we ask this soil to teach us about where our ancestors walked and worked and loved, the places they learned and played, slept and ate and prayed, held weddings and baptisms and communal celebrations. They honored the living and the dead, protected and uplifted each other with love and kindness. The earth tells, excuse me, sorry. The earth tells vital stories. We feel the deep foundation gripping the stones we walk on, the roots of the struggle for freedom that keep trying to reach upward, to emerge and grow until today. We are still learning to make way for rays of light to nourish them. As we cup this sacred soil in our hands, we become grounded in history, surrounded by messages from the earth and blessings from the sky to keep listening, like rain on an autumn day, as it touches everything, our schools, homes, neighborhoods, the river and the trees, these tangible memories of Joseph and Benjamin and the earth that continues to speak.
Mm. Such tenderness there. Such tenderness. And for the human and the humanity, and also through the connection to nature that really comes through, of how do we reorient ourselves as human beings through ritual and through connecting to nature. And I think that's really a ritual what you shared. And I know it was meant for a ritual, so it is.
Yes.
The writing embodies that. Yeah, really beautifully. That's what we need so much more of, I think, in these days, is tenderness.
Yeah, and tenderness that doesn't gloss over the horrors and, you know, the really just the grief of what happened on this land, but also that turns back to the regenerative nature that is soil, you know, and that is more tangible, that is life-giving. So I really appreciated that, you know, your poem began with the soil, moved into, you know, those horrific events, and then turned back to the soil and what it can teach us, which seemed like the point of this ceremony too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this feedback.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things about writing these poems is I don't have feedback, you know what I mean? And
Right.
I just send them and they print them, and it's just it's nice to be able to talk about them and to see some reaction.
I was so struck too when James was sharing that, how I kept hearing the word soil two ways. The soil, going back to the soil as in the stain. And so I thought that was so interesting because it is going back to the stain of history, as well as the regenerative qualities of the soil. So I've never heard it so clearly two ways as in the poem, listening to it through James's ears a bit. But that's another layer there. And I think that speaks to a lot of what you're sharing with us today. And what I'm learning about you and seeing in your work is that there is a lot of returning to the scene of the crime, in a way, the scene of where there was pain, and revisiting the soil and turning it, renewing it. And that's so present. So it makes sense to me when you say, and I feel the genuine spirit when you say, I'm grateful for the experiences I've had because they've allowed me a kind of renewal, in a way, right? That allows me to see the world differently. So that's a real gift. And we don't all make that of our difficult circumstances. So that's a
Yeah.
testament to you as a person and a poet. I feel.
Thank you so much for saying that.
Mm.
Actually, I'm an activist in the community. I work with an organization called Grassroots Alexandria, and we're very much working with civil rights kinds of issues. You know, policing in schools and affordable housing and Medicare for all and all these kinds of things here in Alexandria. We're really focused here. So, you know, all of those things resonate for me, and undocumented immigrants and ICE, all that kind of stuff. So it's really, so for me to be writing these poems for the city, it's just another, it's one more cog in this wheel of my experiences and my passions, you know, for civil rights and human rights and justice, you know, social justice, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to go back to what you said before too, that you don't always write about these much larger issues too, like super important. And like one of my favorite poems is a poem about your father's hands, my father's hands. And so you have this way of like your ability to focus in on the granular and the specific can help absolutely in these larger maybe kind of examinations of culture, but it also applies, the same tenderness is applied to, a poem like that, or, another poem that I love is about you hugging a tree after or was it during the pandemic, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
To that.
Yeah. So there's tenderness everywhere.
Yes, hugging a tree. Sometimes that's what you got to do. There's no one else to hug.
Well, that's exactly right, actually.
Yeah, I read the poem.
I'm going to have to read that poem, James.
Yeah, please
have
do.
you read us out as we come to toward
Okay.
the end of our conversation. You can send us off with that poem.
Okay. So there's hugging the tree, and there's the poem about my father.
Oh yeah, I'd love to hear both.
Okay, actually
Yeah.
they're both pretty short.
I'd love to hear both.
So let me find hugging the tree.
Sure.
Okay. So like James said, I wrote this during the pandemic, and I would walk with a neighbor of mine, and we'd walk, with a distance between us. In the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was so upset and so worried. Hugging the tree. It was neither part of a protest nor a statement to the world. I simply put my arms around a tall oak and stood in embrace, our bodies juxtaposed. There was no swaying. Her trunk, solid and true, felt like an ancestor, a pillar thick with years. Her bark scratched my skin if I moved, so I stayed still. It was a time to be calm and reflect on our presence together, to look up to the sky and fathom the height of my partner, to inhale the earthy scent, to arc my grateful arms around the strong matriarch and whisper into the wood my wordless secret. I have not hugged anyone for months, my dear tree.
I love it. We might be getting a lot of tree hugging poems after people hear you read that, which is not a bad thing at all.
Really not.
And so here's the final poem, My Father's Hands. My father's hands. They were not large, but thick, fleshy workers in the garden, nursing eggplants and fennel, okra and chard, digging and tilling and weeding, making the soil an obliging host. Maybe that's what made his fingers rough in spots. Or maybe it was the constant leafing through books, a loving lick and a flip flap of the page in search of nuggets that would be turned over and over in his mind. After he died, I found bookmarks between pages, carefully pointing, like tags next to seedlings in the earth. These are the plants I hoped for. These are the ideas that made me grow.
We're just breathing over here.
Yeah.
Oh, so lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thank
Just
you so much.
beautiful. Your presence and your work both carry a similar quality. You know, that's not always true. Sometimes the work and the writer feel really different, but the you I imagined into by reading your poems is so much how you hold yourself and how you read your work, and with such a gentleness. And it's just been a real privilege to get to spend time with you and to hear you read the poems. It's really, really a treat that I'll be carrying with me.
Thank you. I'm just really touched by your words, both of you. And you're saying all the things that I think of you as very gentle and beautiful poets, and such so much feeling and so much commitment to, making poetry a part of our lives. And I really appreciate that so much about both of you. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you so much, Zeina.
what a treat. Thank you. Till next time.